Hello everyone, today's video will be a slight departure from the current focus of my channel. Instead of talking about my hobbies, I will be going over some of the issues I encountered in academia as a PhD candidate, or as I like to call it, an entry-level academic. These are also some of the main reasons why I ultimately decided to leave academia after finishing my PhD and search for jobs in the private sector instead. Now, most of these issues will not be unique to the academic work environment. I am aware that it is possible to find terrible workplaces pretty much everywhere. However, I also believe that the unique combination of certain factors in academia can make the work experience there more unsavory than a similar occupation in the industrial or private sector. There's a reason why graduate students are 6 times more likely to experience depression and anxiety than the general population, and over a third of early career researchers end up seeking help for mental health problems caused by their PhD experience. So, if you're considering to do a PhD, here are some things to watch out for. Now before we start, I'd just like to clear up that I am speaking from the perspective of a biologist, a plant biologist to be precise. As academia refers to all sectors of society relating to research and studying, my experience may not be shared by people across different disciplines. However, based on what I've read on the raging dumpster fire of an app known as Twitter, which also happens to be the primary social media platform for academics for some reason, my experience does not seem to be that uncommon, at least in the natural sciences, where around half of all PhD students meet the criteria for depression. If you are from a different field, however, I would love to hear your experiences and whether you can relate to what I say or not. Also, before we proceed, let's do a little survey. If you are one of the 3 people watching my video and are currently an entry-level academic, where would you place yourself on the miserableness scale? Also, if you are working a non-academic job and watching this video for some reason, where on the scale do you place yourself? Let me know in the comments below. Personally, I'd sum up my PhD experience with around 2 or 3, and approximately a third of PhD candidates I know in real life could probably also be placed into that category, while most others I met were relatively neutral about it. I only met one guy who actually enjoyed doing a PhD. Maybe it's because most of the people I know happen to be in the plant sciences and those attract the most miserable people. If you're a plant scientist who isn't miserable, please let me know in the comments. Anyway, without further ado, here are my problems with academia from the perspective of a former sad sack PhD student. Part 1. Work culture. One of the most obvious flaws in the academic system is its work culture. Even as an undergraduate, it was very easy for me to see that most of the graduates, especially PhDs and postdocs, had insane work hours and very little life outside of the workplace. When spending time at any major research institute or university lab, you will inevitably encounter people working 24/7. Throughout my time at uni, I noticed that it didn't matter how late at night it was, there would always be lights on in the labs, and one could see at least 2 to 3 PhDs milling around at all times. And yes, this includes the weekends, and yes, these people were also working during the day. I knew one PhD who would work at the labs from 9 or 10 a.m. to like 2 a.m. every single day of the week. At another institute, I met someone who literally took an inflatable mattress to the lab so that they could sleep there and not have to go home at all. Obviously, not all cases are this extreme, but this kind of behavior is incredibly normalized, and it is hard to find an institution where things like this do not happen. Officially, of course, this shouldn't be a thing. Your typical European work contract will list around 37 to 40 hours of work per week, but you're lucky if you can get away with doing only 50 in some cases. I remember when I was applying for PhD positions, I told a friend I was planning to work 40 hours a week, and they laughed at me, telling me that was basically impossible. In the end, I was actually fortunate enough to find a position at an institute where I was able to get away with working around 40 to 45 hours a week. But this is fairly unusual and can mainly be attributed to the fact that 1. I was chronically ill, 2. I hated my workplace, and 3. We were legally barred from working on the weekends, which was not the case for most other labs. Many other PhD candidates I know work longer hours, or at least claimed to work longer hours than I did. And of course, the extra work does not get paid, in combination with the fact that your typical European PhD candidate will make around minimum wage. The crazy work hours basically mean that they end up working for far below the minimum. Now, in my opinion, such overwork is unacceptable and institutions should make an effort to protect their workers. In private enterprises, at least in theory, having your workers do unpaid overtime is punishable by law, so there is an incentive to avoid it. And yes, I am speaking from a European perspective here. However, in academia, it seems people either turn a blind eye or implicitly encourage this kind of work. Do you think the supervisor of the individual working 16 hours a day or the one bringing a mattress to the labs had any problems with their pupils' work schedules? No, of course not. While such behavior is not explicitly encouraged, there are other ways in which people are pushed to working that much. For example, a supervisor may demand that you obtain results from an experiment within a certain time frame, and the only way to do so is by working all day and night. I remember one PhD candidate who hadn't taken a holiday in years wanted to go to their home country because their mother was ill. In the end, they didn't end up making it because their supervisor actively discouraged them from going, claiming that they were in a critical phase of their research and that they could not abandon their experiments. The problem is that, at least in the biological sciences, it seems like you are always in some kind of critical phase of your research and you always have some kind of insane deadline. Basically, everything else in your life ends up taking a backseat whether you like it or not. Based on my experiences and observations of those around me, it is practically guaranteed that you will miss things like family reunions, weddings, trips with friends, and concerts, all because of the crazy workload and the limited time frame, especially in many European systems where the duration of the PhD is set to 3 or 4 years without the possibility of extension. In my last year of the PhD, I took 5 days off for the entire year, and half of those were illness related. Do you know how many holidays we legally get here in France? Almost 40. The best part was that after my contract ended, I was still working non-stop for 3 months without any kind of payment just to finish up my manuscript and prepare for my defense. Anyway, on the subject of constant pressure, this brings us to my next issue: long-term stress. The long-term stress that goes hand in hand with doing a PhD and to a certain extent a postdoc is one of the most insidious things about the academic experience. Of course, stress can be found in most educational or professional settings. For instance, as an undergraduate, there would be a few months every year where I did nothing but sleep and study. Looking back, I'm not quite sure how I managed to get through these times, but I believe a major reason was the fact that although the stress levels were insane, they were temporary, and the vast majority of my uni days were relatively relaxed. The PhD experience, on the other hand, was essentially 4 years of constant stress. It's hard to describe, but it feels like you have this immense, unpredictable project you're tackling all by yourself in a limited time frame, and no matter how much work you put in, you know that at any given moment you could always be doing more. I remember feeling guilty every time I took a coffee break or socialized with people. I had language lessons once a week that were literally sponsored by my workplace, and even then, it felt like I was wasting time by attending them instead of staying in the lab to do experiments. Even the group meetings were stressful for me because they felt like they were taking up my time that could instead be used for lab work. I constantly felt like I was never doing enough while also being completely exhausted and demotivated. Sometimes the stress was so bad that I could physically feel it in my body, like a hand was inside my ribcage squeezing down onto my heart. Even on the weekends and on the occasional holidays, I was never able to shake the feeling that I still had so much work to do and that I should be doing more. Essentially, my goddamn thesis was looming over my head like the sword of Damocles. Unfortunately, people can only be chronically stressed for so long before their physical and mental health begins to suffer, which was exactly what happened in my case. It got so bad I ended up going on medical leave for 2 months. Ultimately, I wrecked myself, all for the sake of academic self-realization, and now I have chronic health problems that persist despite me being in a much better place now than I was back then. So if you happen to be listening to this and some of the things I am describing sound familiar, beware. If you can physically feel the stress, you need to hit the brakes, otherwise you will crash and burn at some point down the line. Another warning sign of imminent burnout is feeling extremely negative towards your workplace. If you feel dread, sadness, or anger every single time you have to drag yourself there, I know I sure did, you need to do something about that because it is not sustainable. Looking back, I probably should have quit, but I didn't. And do you know why I, and so many other academics in similar situations, chose not to do so? The answer is optionlessness in academia. I will preface this section by saying that yes, theoretically, there is always an option to leave or go somewhere else in most cases. No one is holding a gun to a researcher's head, forcing them to continue their projects in a toxic work environment. However, there are a number of factors that often lead to people forcing themselves through the most awful work conditions instead of quitting and finding a job somewhere else, like one would in the private sector. The first reason is that if you quit a PhD, you essentially lose everything. All the months and years of work will be for nothing. You will obtain no qualifications, essentially setting you back to where you were when you first started. Of course, you may have gained a bunch of new skill sets while working on your project, but in the eyes of academia and a large proportion of employers, you will still be at the same level as your last degree. Because PhDs are so specialized and every project is unique, it is also basically impossible to switch departments or institutions without having to start from scratch. Furthermore, many people I know, myself included, went abroad to do their PhD. Quitting would mean being stranded in a foreign country while trying to find a place to go next, which is not necessarily going to be in the same region. In some cases, it's easier to just stay and force yourself through it than to go through the hassle of reapplying to different positions and having to obtain things like visas. Then there's the lack of other options in general. Even if you're able to quit, you may not be able to find anything else. Funding for research is extremely limited, and past the master's level, researchers become very specialized, which means your qualifications limit your options even further. For instance, I'm a plant scientist, so I was only really able to apply for plant science PhDs matching my previous research experiences, which is fine, because that's what I wanted to do. But this also means that it's basically impossible for me to switch to a field like immunology or microbiology even if I wanted to. Within one's field, there are typically not many funded positions, and there is a bunch of competition from all over the world. Many people are happy to just get a PhD position in the first place. Even if the lab has a bad reputation and the people were warned in advance, they will often still accept the position due to this lack of other options. At least that's what I've observed in the biological sciences. And this is why those Twitter threads full of useful tips for prospective PhD students annoy me so much, because they will often give advice like, how to select a good supervisor, things to look out for in a lab. As if looking for academic positions is like buying a second-hand car. Like, I'm sorry, we do not have that many options. Anyway, on the subject of supervisors, let's get into my next problem, the antiquated, hierarchical nature of research and the power imbalances within. Now, I may be a bit biased because I spent most of my life attending international educational institutions, and any work experience I and my peers have had so far were generally in environments that were very corporate and modern, for lack of a better term. I was also very fortunate that the university I did my bachelor's degree in was typically very supportive of its students and valued things such as diversity and mental health. This led me to believe that academia as a whole was generally a very progressive, international and welcoming environment. Well, that illusion was shattered very quickly when I accepted my PhD position at a French institution. Now, before I elaborate further, I'm not saying that the issues I had were because my institute was French. As a matter of fact, a lot of these issues can be encountered at facilities all over the world, and I know a bunch of international workers who had very similar experiences in countries such as Germany, Poland, and Japan. Based on my own observations, working at an academic institution can feel quite antiquated compared to working in an equivalent sector in industry. at least in research. I encountered numerous practices that would absolutely not be acceptable in my friends' more corporate workplaces, but because this is academia and these things are so common, no one bats an eye. For example, there are quite a few institutes where there are absolutely no repercussions for group leaders getting into relationships with their subordinates, something which most companies have policies against nowadays. Another example which I experienced personally was the way my workplace treated us international workers. When applying for my position, the only language requirement for the job was English. So imagine my surprise when, after arriving at my new work environment, around 2/3 of the workforce could only speak French. Luckily, I had taken French in high school, so I still had some basic skills. But it was rough, especially because a lot of people I had to directly rely on to show me things could not speak English. Furthermore, a bunch of important protocols for experiments and things like hazardous chemical waste disposal were only available in French. Now, I'm not saying everything needs to be in English at a research facility. I'm just saying that if you hire international workers, some of which cannot speak a word of your local language because you do not specify any language requirements outside of English, it should be, or you shouldn't be hiring those people in the first place. In general, I found my workplace was severely lacking in intercultural sensitivity, and unfortunately, this is not very uncommon at academic institutions, at least in Europe. I have international friends at other facilities who experienced racist microaggressions or outright racism, even at larger, more international institutes where you would expect people to know better. Based on what I've read on Twitter, things do not seem to be much better for other marginalized groups either. The problem is that there's very little awareness of these issues in academia outside of the people who are directly affected by them. And there appears to be very little incentive for institutes to change since, as previously explained, people will still keep flocking to your workplace as long as the research is good and there are positions corresponding with their qualifications due to the limited supply of positions in general. Now, you may be wondering, why don't people kick up more of a fuss? Well, allow me to introduce you to the insane power imbalance in academia. Again, power imbalances are something you can encounter in almost all workplaces, but I feel like they are especially pronounced in academia, and they are also a lot harder to escape. Firstly, as a PhD candidate and to a certain extent a postdoc, you are very reliant on a small group of people, primarily your lab and more specifically your supervisor. In the case of my institute, a majority of these people had permanent contracts, which means that they were there long before I arrived and they will be there long after I left. This means that anytime there was any issue I had with the dynamics of the group, no matter who I approached, they would, unsurprisingly, always side with their colleagues. This was the same for pretty much any other international worker or person with a short-term contract. There was no support. The fact that we were also a minority, for the first year of the PhD I was literally the only PhD candidate and international worker in my group, exacerbates this unequal dynamic further. Now, permanent contracts may not be as common in other institutions, but there is plenty of potential for weird power dynamics to go around. For example, I knew 2 people from different countries who both had massive issues at their workplaces because they were being bullied by their supervisor's spouse, who happened to work in the same lab. And of course, who will the supervisor side with when there is a conflict? Their long-term partner, or some random PhD or postdoc who will be gone in a few years anyways? However, the worst kind of power imbalance of them all is that between a supervisor and their pupil, especially in the case of PhD candidates. Now, I am very fortunate that despite my negative PhD experience overall, I never had any major issues with my supervisor, who always remained friendly and supportive. However, I know enough people who had absolutely catastrophic experiences and was able to witness some of the toxicity in my immediate environment firsthand. The relationship one has with one supervisor can make or break a PhD experience, as you are basically dependent on them for graduation, and it often seems like they can treat you however they want and face no repercussions for it whatsoever. There is an endless amount of stories of how supervisors abuse their power and how this is often a major reason why a lot of people leave academia. they are essentially bullied out of it, and yet nothing seems to be done about it. The insane thing is that there are known serial abusers that have a terrible track record of people dropping out under their watch, and that still get new students every year, as their research is simply that prestigious. It seems like once you are a big name in the field, you can basically get away with anything. And while I wish I could say this is a thing that only happens in small, obscure European facilities whose work culture is still stuck in the 90s, this happens at big, fancy, well-known, top-ranking international institutes and universities as well. And in theory, those should have facilities in place to protect their employees. I suspect there is an even bigger number of abusers who are only known by a very small network of people, as it can be very damaging to an early-stage researcher's career to speak out about such things. Academic networks are very small and tight-knit. If you come out with allegations of abuse or downright illegal things against someone with a high profile, it is often your career in the field that may come to an end, as other colleagues would rather side with the more powerful individual with whom they could potentially collaborate, as opposed to you, a replaceable early-stage researcher. I have witnessed 2 times now how a supervisor bullied a PhD candidate into quitting. In one case, they even prevented them from getting a position at another lab within the field by reaching out to their colleague who had considered hiring the candidate when they applied. In the end, this person had to switch to a completely different field to avoid the toxic influence of their former supervisor. And of course, that toxic supervisor immediately accepted a new PhD candidate once the previous one had been kicked out. Now, I could keep going on for a long time about how awful supervisor-student relationships can be, but I think you get the point. I can link to some articles featuring the most high-profile and egregious examples in the description. Remember how a while ago I was making fun of those Twitter threads providing tips on how to find a good lab and supervisor? While I do find them a bit ridiculous in the assumption that you have much of a choice to begin with, they do have a point. I would definitely recommend screening any labs you want to apply for potential toxicity. The best way to do so is by privately contacting people who are in the same position as you are applying to, but have already left, and see what they say. If they warn you, stay away. Just trust me, it's easier to find something else before starting somewhere and having to give up halfway through, or wasting multiple years of your life being miserable just to graduate, when you likely could have graduated somewhere else with half the struggle. Now, I've been going over these factors and I'm already kind of sick of having to make this video. However, there's one more issue with academia that I feel like I should address, and that is that there is no future and no stability, at least in the current system. Academia is basically a pyramid scheme. If you are just starting out, there is virtually no chance of obtaining a permanent position, at least here in Europe. Instead, after obtaining their PhDs, those staying in academia will often be doomed to an endless cycle of postdocs, which, depending on the country, can pay very badly and only last around 1 to 2 years, after which point you need to uproot your entire life once more to find a new position, all while getting older and more specialized, making it harder to find jobs outside of academia, which you will likely be forced to do at some point because it is hard to keep living that way if you want any kind of stability in your life. Furthermore, some countries like France have a maximum number of years you can spend in public research on short-term contracts before you are kicked from the academic system forever anyways. And even if you beat the odds and ascend to whatever comes after a postdoc, I assume it's something like an assistant professor or something, things typically will not get any easier for you. The workload will not decrease, while your competition will only grow as the air gets thinner and thinner the higher you get within the system. Also, your work-life balance will likely get even worse if you even had one before. However, what occurs beyond entry-level academia is a subject I know very little about, nor am I especially interested in finding out more, as I have already experienced enough of this world to know that I want no part of it. Okay, so that was a long, unhinged rant. If you are an early stage researcher, I would love to hear from you in the comments section. What has your experience been so far? Do you agree with the points I make? If you found this video interesting, please also give it a like. You can also subscribe if you want. I am planning to make more of these kinds of video essays about topics near and dear to my heart in the future. And I'm also considering to make a more in-depth video about my PhD experience as a whole. although the main focus of this channel will still remain to document things I actually enjoy, like art and my pet snakes, so be warned. Until then, remember to stay safe, avoid toxic workplaces, and prioritize your mental health. Goodbye!